Level 0. It began not with a siren, but with a metaphor. In 1947, 2 years after the atomic bomb turned Hiroshima to ash, the scientists who built it realized something unsettling. They had changed the world, but no one was changing how to live in it. The Cold War was just a frost then, tensions high, but not yet crystallized. So they created a symbol, not a treaty, not a threat, a clock. The bulletin of the atomic scientists moved the hands to 7 minutes before midnight, and the message was clear. If nothing changes, everything ends. The danger wasn't just bombs, it was the silence between nations. No international frameworks, no safeguards, no precedent for surviving a world armed with extinction-level weapons. The minute hand was a warning, not of what had happened, but what could. The Doomsday clock isn't a countdown, it's a barometer of science, policy, diplomacy, and risk. The closer to midnight, the tighter the squeeze on survival. Level 1. The nuclear monopoly didn't last. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. First lightning. The arms race had begun. By 1952, the US escalated with the first hydrogen bomb, 500 times more powerful than the one dropped on Nagasaki. Months later, the USSR matched it. This wasn't strategy, this was escalation. The theory of mutually assured destruction hadn't even been coined yet, but the logic was already in motion. If both sides had the bomb, no one could win a war. But that didn't stop them from building more. By 1953, the clock moved forward to 3 minutes before midnight, its most alarming setting yet. Humanity now had the power to erase itself several times over, and seemed eager to prove it. This was also the era of brinkmanship, the policy of pushing an opponent to the edge of war to force concessions. Nuclear weapons weren't last resorts, they were bargaining chips. The risk isn't just having weapons, it's the belief that you can control chaos when the rules break. History shows you can't. Level 2. Then came the shock of restraint. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world within hours of nuclear war. Soviet missiles in Cuba, US blockades, one miscommunication away from catastrophe. But instead of launching, both sides stepped back. The aftermath sparked something rare: cooperation. The Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. It didn't disarm the superpowers, but it was a signal of a willingness to preserve the world they were threatening. The clock moved backward to 12 minutes before midnight, a moment of optimism. Diplomacy had worked. Still, behind the headlines, both nations continued stockpiling. But at least now, there were rules. Crises force clarity. In their wake, nations often make their best decisions, not out of trust, but out of fear of repeating the near miss. Level 3. But treaties alone don't hold back ambition. By the late 1960s, China had joined the nuclear club. France and the UK already had weapons. Tensions were flaring in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. In 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, was signed, a global promise to stop the spread of nuclear weapons and pursue disarmament. It was a landmark. But it came with a catch. The 5 official nuclear states didn't give up their arsenals. Meanwhile, wars in Vietnam and proxy conflicts reminded the world that the nuclear umbrella wasn't protecting peace, just changing how wars were fought. By 1969, the bulletin adjusted the clock to 10 minutes to midnight. A mix of progress and peril. There was structure, but there was also stagnation. Treaties don't eliminate threats, they only slow them down. Without enforcement and equity, they risk becoming symbols instead of shields. Level 4. The Cold War caught fire again, this time colder and closer. The 1980s were marked by ideological division, proxy wars, and military buildup. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 reignited tensions. The US responded with new missiles in Europe. Reagan's Evil Empire speech made the rift official. Worse, technology had made nuclear war faster. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, gave nations second strike capabilities. early warning systems promised 30 minutes or less to decide between retaliation or restraint. And then came 1983, NATO's war game. Able Archer 83 came dangerously close to being interpreted as a real attack. The Soviet Union's early warning satellite falsely detected incoming US missiles. One man, Stanislav Petrov, ignored the alert and may have prevented World War III. The clock jolted back to 3 minutes before midnight, as close as it had ever been. This wasn't about intent, it was about accident. Systems so complex they broke under their own logic. Most nuclear wars won't start with malice. They'll start with a blip, a glitch, a misread radar. Risk comes not just from actors, but from systems. Level 5. Then, impossibly, came the thaw. The Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed, and with it, the shadow of nuclear confrontation lifted, however briefly. Treaties followed. START-10, 1991, reduced long-range nuclear arsenals. Presidential nuclear initiatives led to major tactical weapon withdrawals. Former Soviet republics like Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan gave up nuclear weapons entirely. It wasn't just a change in arsenals, it was a shift in global posture. The threat hadn't vanished, but it had paused. So, in 1991, the Doomsday clock was moved back to 17 minutes before midnight, the safest setting in its history. There was a genuine belief that the 21st century would be different, that weapons of mass destruction would become relics, not tools. But underneath that hope, something lingered. Loose nukes, unstable economies, and a creeping new threat: non-state actors. Collapse of empires doesn't guarantee peace. Sometimes the most dangerous period is what follows, when power fragments and control dissolves. Level 6. 1991, the fall of the wall and the rise of hope, 17 minutes to midnight. This is the farthest humanity has ever stood from midnight, a record-setting 17 minutes of breathing room. Why? Because the Cold War had ended, the Berlin Wall was rubble, the Soviet Union was dissolving, and arms control was finally working. In 1991, the US and the newly formed Russian Federation signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START-1, committing to verifiable reductions of nuclear arsenals. Tens of thousands of warheads were taken off alert. Submarines were decommissioned. Silos stood empty. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was disarmament. The Doomsday clock, for once, ticked backward, from the 1980s tense proximity to annihilation to nearly 6 p.m. on the existential clock. It felt like history was healing, but optimism has a shelf life. Level 7. 1995. Nuclear shadows return, 14 minutes to midnight. Just 4 years later, the hand edged forward again, from 17 to 14 minutes. The Cold War was over, yes, but the weapons remained. Russia struggled with post-Soviet chaos. Some feared nuclear materials could be stolen or sold. NATO expanded eastward, stoking suspicion in Moscow. Tensions weren't gone, just quieter. Meanwhile, global arms treaties began showing cracks. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, had been negotiated but not yet ratified by major powers. And in places like South Asia, the nuclear club was getting crowded. India and Pakistan hadn't tested yet, but they were building capacity. It wasn't crisis, but it wasn't peace either. It was drift. And drift, on a ticking clock, is never harmless. Level 8. 1998. The bomb returns to the spotlight, 9 minutes to midnight. This time, it was loud. In May 1998, India conducted 5 nuclear tests in the Pokhran Desert. 2 weeks later, Pakistan responded with its own. The subcontinent was now nuclear-armed, and openly so. The clock jumped forward to 9 minutes. These weren't just underground tests. They were geopolitical fireworks. The Kargil conflict in 1999, a war fought by 2 nuclear states, added fuel to the concern. Suddenly, the unthinkable wasn't just about superpowers. It was about rivals with recent history and itchy trigger fingers. At the same time, the US Senate refused to ratify the CTBT. Global disarmament was stalling, and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists warned, political leaders have failed to deal with nuclear dangers that still persist. The optimism of the 90s was gone. The countdown had resumed. Level 9. 2002. The Age of Terror and the End of Treaties. 7 minutes to midnight. By 2002, the post-9/11 world had changed the threat map. The Doomsday clock moved again, now just 7 minutes from midnight. Why? Two things: policy and proliferation. First, the US withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, a Cold War relic meant to prevent a new arms race in missile defense. Second, the War on Terror had begun, and with it, fears of nuclear weapons falling into non-state hands. Al-Qaeda had expressed interest in nuclear materials. Loose nukes in unstable regions became a serious concern. At the same time, North Korea expelled weapons inspectors and walked out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. A few months later, Iran's enrichment program raised international alarm. The old balance of terror, superpower versus superpower, had mutated. The new threats were decentralized and harder to deter. Level 10. 2007. The rise of the twin threats. 5 minutes to midnight. This was the year the clock's logic changed. In 2007, the Bulletin updated its scope. For the first time, they acknowledged that nuclear war wasn't the only existential threat. Climate change had joined the conversation. Why? Because sea level rise, extreme heat, resource conflict, and ecosystem collapse all carried risks that could destabilize nations and societies. And instability breeds conflict. In parallel, North Korea had tested a nuclear device in 2006. Iran was under growing suspicion, and US-Russia cooperation had cooled dramatically. Technology wasn't helping either. Cyber warfare was growing, missile systems were more complex, and new doctrines blurred the line between conventional and nuclear force. The clock moved to 5 minutes, not because the bomb was closer, but because more fuses had been lit. Level 11. 2012. Inertia becomes the threat. 5 minutes to midnight. No movement in 5 years, but not because things improved. In 2012, the clock stayed at 5 minutes, but for a grim reason. We weren't moving forward. We weren't preparing. We were standing still, in front of a countdown. The bulletin cited stalled global leadership, no new nuclear treaties, no serious response to climate signals, no action on emerging threats like synthetic biology or autonomous weapon systems. It wasn't drama, it was drift, again. But this time, the consequences were planetary. Sea ice was vanishing. Weather extremes were becoming the norm. North Korea was prepping more tests. The lesson: a lack of crisis doesn't mean a lack of danger. Level 12. 2015. New technologies, old threats, 3 minutes to midnight. By 2015, technology had outrun ethics. Cybersecurity breaches affected nuclear systems. AI began creeping into military decision-making. Autonomous drones and smart weaponry were real, and yet nuclear postures remained on Cold War logic. The Doomsday clock leapt to 3 minutes. Why? North Korea had tested again. Iran's nuclear deal was under strain. The US and Russia were modernizing their arsenals, not dismantling them. But the scariest part? Climate modeling was getting worse. 2014 had just become the hottest year on record, a record soon to be broken repeatedly. Melting permafrost released methane. The Amazon was approaching carbon sink failure. And still, no coordinated global plan. The threats weren't speculative, they were accelerating, and the world's best answer was delay. Level 13. 2018, 2 minutes to midnight. The hands moved again. This time, back to a place the world hadn't seen since the fire and ash brinkmanship of 1953. 2 minutes to midnight. But it didn't feel like history repeating. It felt worse, not because the bombs were bigger, but because the threats were blurred, splintered, and emerging from every angle. Diplomacy no longer spoke in complete sentences. Tweets replaced treaties. The carefully worded frameworks of nuclear peace frayed with each press conference. North Korea's missile tests flew farther. Its hydrogen bomb detonation in 2017 shook more than the ground. It cracked the illusion of control. The US president responded not with strategy, but with fire and fury threats. And while photo ops and handshake summits followed in 2018, the warheads remained, uncounted, unchecked, and very much alive. Then came the unraveling of the Iran nuclear deal. Years of painstaking negotiation undone in an afternoon. America pulled out. Iran, in turn, restarted uranium enrichment. Europe tried to hold the pieces together, but the glass had already shattered. Trust had left the room. But the ticking wasn't just nuclear. The climate shouted, and the world barely flinched. 2018 marked another year of record-breaking temperatures. Oceans absorbed more heat. Ice vanished from the Arctic. Wildfires tore through California, Australia, and Greece, reducing neighborhoods to ash in hours. Yet global leadership didn't rise. It receded. The United States officially began withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, signaling not just policy failure, but moral abdication. Other nations stalled, sidestepped, or diluted their promises. Warnings from scientists landed with less force than a stock market dip. Disinformation bloomed in that silence. Online, truth competed with spectacle and lost. Conspiracies spread faster than science. Authoritarian regimes grew bolder. Multilateralism, the glue of post-war peace, began to peel at the edges. The Bulletin called it the new abnormal. A world where humanity flirted with catastrophe daily, not in shock, but in routine. Nuclear weapons, carbon skies, algorithms that could deepfake a war before it began. The clock stood still at 2 minutes, but everything else was accelerating. Level 14. 2020, 100 seconds to midnight. They didn't move the hands to a minute mark this time. They used seconds. 100 seconds to midnight. The Doomsday clock, for the first time in its history, ticked inside the 2-minute barrier. Not because of one explosion, but because the fuse had spread everywhere. On the nuclear front, the foundation was crumbling. The INF Treaty, once the backbone of arms control between Russia and the United States, collapsed. Strategic treaties like New START dangled in uncertainty. New warhead development resumed. China quietly expanded its arsenal. North Korea returned to testing. India and Pakistan edged toward their own unstable balance. But it wasn't just bombs that worried scientists. It was the warming world beneath them. The past decade had become the hottest ever recorded. Ice sheets in Greenland lost hundreds of billions of tons. Coral reefs blinked out of existence. Bushfires in Australia turned daylight into blood-orange smoke. The Amazon, long a carbon sink, showed signs of flipping, becoming a carbon source instead. And yet global emissions had barely declined. But what really pushed the clock closer wasn't just the data. It was the decay of capacity. The world no longer seemed able or willing to respond. Political leaders mocked science. International institutions sputtered. Misinformation metastasized online, feeding distrust, denial, and rage. And then came the virus. A silent hitch in a stranger's breath. A cough on a train. A fever across borders. COVID-19 was not a bomb, nor a climate anomaly, but it exposed every weakness the clock had been measuring. Global cooperation fractured on impact. Borders closed. Medical systems cracked. Vaccines became political weapons. Rich nations hoarded. Poor ones waited. And millions died while misinformation clogged airwaves and inboxes. COVID wasn't why the clock moved to 100 seconds, but it was why it stayed there. And why, for the first time, the metaphor felt too slow. Because the threat wasn't theoretical anymore. The future had already arrived. Level 15. 2023, 90 seconds to midnight. They moved the hands again. 10 seconds closer, 90 seconds to midnight. The closest humanity has ever been to its own symbolic annihilation. Not because of a singular catastrophe, but because multiple tipping points were now tipping at once. In February 2022, Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, and with them came echoes of the nuclear age. For the first time since the Cold War, a nuclear-armed state invaded a European neighbor. Cities were shelled, civilians buried. Power plants, including Chernobyl, came under fire. Then came the threats. Moscow hinted it might use nuclear weapons. Western leaders braced for escalation. Doctrines built on deterrence cracked under pressure. No one quite knew where the line was anymore. At the same time, global climate chaos escalated. Europe experienced its hottest summer in recorded history. Pakistan was submerged by floods that displaced over 30 million people. China's Yangtze River nearly dried out. Drought gripped the Horn of Africa. Entire harvests failed. But the world still couldn't act together. International cooperation had been shredded by war, nationalism, economic protectionism, and tech-driven tribalism. And something else had arrived: fast, quiet, and transformative: artificial intelligence. In late 2022, generative AI models burst into public consciousness. Machines could now write, draw, code, even impersonate. While the breakthroughs stunned, the warnings piled up. AI experts cautioned about misuse, disinformation, job disruption, autonomous weapons, and systems learning faster than we could regulate. The bulletin added AI explicitly to its list of existential risks, not because it would end the world tomorrow, but because the infrastructure for oversight didn't exist. Power was moving faster than governance. Again. Meanwhile, pandemic lessons faded. Vaccine hesitancy surged. Public trust eroded further. And preparations for the next outbreak were underfunded and ignored. At 90 seconds to midnight, the message was stark. The world is stuck in a cascade of failure. Failure to de-escalate war, failure to cut emissions, failure to govern new technologies, failure to cooperate even in the face of extinction. The clock is no longer a metaphor of fear. It's a mirror, and we're looking right into it. Thanks for watching this video. See you in the next one.